The most terrifying monsters don't hide under your bed. They sit across from you at the dinner table. They help you with your homework. They say, "I love you," before you fall asleep. And sometimes, in the dead of night, they reach for a hammer. On a quiet January morning in 2016 in an affluent neighborhood of Habra Heights, California, a house sat silent, too silent. The kind of silence that makes the birds stop singing, that makes the wind hold its breath. Inside that house, behind freshly painted walls and manicured hedges, lay the bodies of 4 people: a mother, a father, a brother, an uncle, all bludgeoned to death while they slept, all killed by someone they loved, all killed by someone they trusted with their lives. I've told a lot of stories, dark stories. Stories that keep you awake at night and make you check the locks twice. But this one haunts me differently. Because this story isn't about a stranger breaking in. It's not about a random act of violence that shattered a peaceful home. This story is about what happens when the monster isn't outside trying to get in. This story is about what happens when the monster has been inside all along, sleeping in the room next door, eating breakfast beside you, pretending to be your son. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that you hear this story. What matters is that you understand how a family that looked perfect from the outside could harbor a darkness so complete, so absolute, that it would consume them all. What matters is that by the time I'm done telling you this, you'll never look at a closed door the same way again. Before you continue, I need you to do something. If you're watching this late at night, if you're alone, if something in your gut is telling you to click away, don't. Stay with me. Because the people who died in that house deserve to have their story told. And more importantly, the truth of what happened needs to be understood. So subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because what I'm about to tell you could save a life. It could be yours. It could be someone you love. Let me take you back. Let me take you to the beginning. The Han family had achieved what so many dreamed of. They had immigrated from Taiwan, worked tirelessly, and built something beautiful in the golden promise of California. Guojun Han, the father, was a hard-working man in his 50s who had spent decades building a life for his family. He wasn't wealthy by Beverly Hills standards, but in La Habra Heights, he had found his slice of the American dream. A nice house, a good car, children who went to good schools. What more could a man ask for? His wife, Ming Huan, was the heart of the household, the kind of mother who cooked every meal from scratch, who attended every school function, who believed with absolute certainty that her children would do great things. She had given up everything for this family, her career in Taiwan, her friends, her culture. She had wrapped her entire identity around being a wife and mother, and she had done it gladly because that's what love looked like to her. Then there were the sons. The older one, Jeffrey, was 23 years old in 2016. He was supposed to be the pride of the family. And the firstborn son in a traditional household carries weight that outsiders can never fully understand. He was supposed to be the golden child, the one who would honor his parents' sacrifice, the one who would prove that every hour of overtime, every missed vacation, every penny saved had been worth it. And then there was Jeff's younger brother, a teenager still finding his way, a kid who looked up to his older brother, who shared a roof with him, who had no idea that danger was sleeping just down the hall. There was also the uncle, Meng Han, Guo's brother, who had come to visit. He was staying at the house, enjoying time with family, completely unaware that his visit would become a death sentence. From the outside, the Hans looked like any other suburban family. Maybe a little more traditional. Maybe a little more private. But normal. Enviably normal. Their neighbors would later describe them as quiet, respectful, the kind of people who waved hello and kept their lawn neat. The kind of people you'd never imagine on the evening news. But behind those walls, pressure was building. You see, there's a specific kind of pressure that exists in certain families. It's invisible to outsiders. But to those living under it, it's as real as gravity. It's the pressure to succeed, to achieve, to never, ever disappoint. In traditional Asian households, and I say this not to generalize, but to help you understand the specific world Jeffrey Hahn inhabited, academic and professional success isn't just encouraged. It's expected. It's mandatory. It's the only path. Jeffrey Hahn had grown up under this pressure. Every test score mattered. Every grade was scrutinized. His parents had sacrificed everything, and in return they expected excellence. Not because they were cruel, but because in their minds, this was love. Pushing your child to succeed was how you protected them, how you ensured they'd have a better life than you did. But what happens when a child can't meet those expectations? What happens when the weight becomes too heavy to bear? What happens when, instead of asking for help, a person starts to lie? Jeffrey Hahn started lying. It began small, as these things always do. A grade inflation here, a white lie there. Yes, Mom, I'm doing well in school. Yes, Dad, everything is on track. But lies are hungry things. They need to be fed. And each lie required a bigger lie to sustain it. Jeffrey had told his parents he was a student at UCLA. He wasn't. He had been enrolled at community college, and even there he had struggled. But his parents believed he was studying to become a success. They believed their son was on the path they had carved for him, with their blood and their sweat and their tears. They had no idea that every conversation about his education was built on sand. The lies compounded. Jeffrey created an entire false life. He would leave the house as if going to classes. He would study his fabrications like they were the real curriculum. He became an expert not in academics, but in deception. And with each passing day, the gap between who his parents thought he was and who he actually was grew wider. This is the part of the story where I need you to sit with something uncomfortable. Because here's the thing about lies. They don't just hurt the liar. They create prisons. They build walls. And eventually those walls start closing in. Jeffrey Hahn had built himself a prison of pretense. Every family dinner was a performance. Every question about school was a landmine. Every "We're so proud of you, son," was a knife in his chest. Because he knew. He knew the truth. And he knew, somewhere deep in the dark corners of his mind, that the truth would eventually come out. The question was, what would happen when it did? What Jeffrey couldn't know, what none of them could know, was that his lies had created a ticking clock. Every day that passed wound the spring tighter. Every false smile, every fabricated story, every "everything's fine" added pressure to a vessel that was already cracking. And pressure, as physics teaches us, always finds a way out. The house on the hillside sat quiet in the California sun. Birds sang in the trees. Sprinklers clicked on and off. Cars drove past on their way to ordinary lives. And inside, a young man was slowly losing his grip on everything that held him together. This is where our story truly begins. Not with the violence, we'll get there, but with the silence. The terrible, suffocating silence of a secret that had grown too large to contain. I want you to understand something about Jeffrey Hahn before we go further. I want you to understand because what comes next is incomprehensible without context. I'm not asking you to sympathize with him. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to understand how a person gets to the point where the unthinkable becomes thinkable. Because if we don't understand that, then we learn nothing from this tragedy, and 4 people will have died for nothing. Jeffrey Hahn was not stupid. Let me be clear about that. He was not a low-achieving student because of lack of intelligence. He was, by most accounts, a bright young man. But brightness doesn't guarantee success, and intelligence doesn't inoculate you against psychological dysfunction. Jeffrey struggled not because he couldn't learn, but because something inside him was fundamentally misaligned with the path his family had chosen for him. Imagine, if you will, being told from birth that there is one acceptable version of success, one acceptable career, one acceptable trajectory. Now imagine that trajectory feels impossible to you. Not difficult, impossible. Like being told to fly by flapping your arms. You could try forever and never achieve it. But everyone around you seems to believe you can fly. They keep pushing you off higher and higher ledges, certain that this time you'll soar. Jeffrey's response to this impossible situation was not to speak up, not to tell his parents that he was struggling, not to ask for help. His response was to construct an elaborate fiction that allowed everyone to believe what they wanted to believe, while he sank deeper and deeper into a hole of his own making. The UCLA lie was the cornerstone of this fiction. In his parents' minds, Jeffrey was a college student at one of the most prestigious universities in the country. They told their friends, they told their family back in Taiwan, their son, the UCLA student, their son, the future success story, their son, the validation of every sacrifice they had ever made. In reality, Jeffrey was adrift. He had attended community college, yes, but his enrollment had lapsed. He wasn't studying anything. He wasn't working toward anything. He was existing in the shadow of a lie that had taken on a life of its own. Each day was an exercise in theater. He would wake up, eat breakfast with his family, grab his backpack, and leave the house. His parents assumed he was going to campus. Instead, he would drive around, sit in parking lots, kill time at libraries or coffee shops. He was living a double life, and the exhaustion of maintaining that life was corroding him from the inside out. But here's what makes Jeffrey's situation particularly volatile. He wasn't just lying about school. The lies had metastasized. They had spread into every aspect of his identity. He told his parents he had a girlfriend at UCLA. He didn't. He told them about professors who didn't exist, classes he'd never attended, achievements he'd never accomplished. Each lie required supporting lies, and those lies required their own support until Jeffrey had constructed an entire alternate reality that existed only in the space between his words and his parents' ears. Living inside a lie does something to a person. It creates a constant low-level panic. Every conversation is a potential trap. Every question is a threat. The people who love you most become your greatest danger, because they're the ones most likely to accidentally unravel the thread that holds your false life together. Jeffrey's anxiety was climbing. He was sleeping poorly, he was irritable, he was withdrawing from social connections because maintaining the lie with his family was already exhausting. Adding friends to the equation was unthinkable. His world was shrinking, narrowing, focusing down to a single point of fear, exposure. And then the walls started closing in. His parents began asking more questions. Perhaps they sensed something. Perhaps they were just showing normal parental interest. But to Jeffrey, each question felt like an interrogation. Each "how was class today" was a test he was perpetually failing. Each expression of pride in their eyes was salt in a wound that wouldn't heal. There's a psychological concept called cognitive dissonance. It's the mental discomfort that comes from holding two contradictory beliefs at once. Jeffrey was experiencing this at a crushing level. He knew who he actually was. He knew who his parents believed him to be. And the gap between those two identities was a chasm that was swallowing him whole. Normal people, when backed into a corner like this, might confess, they might break down, they might run away. There are exits from this prison that don't involve violence, but Jeffrey Hahn didn't see those exits, or if he saw them, they seemed worse than the alternative. In his distorted thinking, the shame of exposure was unsurvivable. The disappointment in his parents' eyes would be a death of its own. Better to what? I need to pause here because I want you to think about something. How well do you really know the people closest to you? I mean, really know them. Not the surface, not the performance they give at dinner parties or family gatherings, but the truth of who they are when no one is watching. The fears they carry, the secrets they keep, the desperation they hide behind their smiles. The Han family thought they knew Jeffrey. They thought they knew their son, their brother, their nephew. They were wrong, and their error would cost them their lives. Here's the chilling part. Jeffrey's facade was convincing enough that no one suspected a thing. There were no warning signs obvious enough to trigger alarm. He wasn't violent. He wasn't vocal about any distress. He was just quiet, withdrawn, private. And in a family that valued success over emotional expression, being quiet and private didn't raise red flags. It was almost expected. The days leading up to January 2016 were unremarkable. The family went through their routines, meals were eaten, conversations were had. Life happened. There was no dramatic confrontation. No moment where Jeffrey's lie was exposed and rage followed. That would almost be easier to understand. No. What happened was worse. Jeffrey Hahn began planning. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, not with montages and ominous music. He planned the way a drowning person plans to survive, desperately, frantically, with a tunnel vision that excluded all alternatives. In his mind, and I want to be clear that I'm not endorsing his reasoning, merely explaining it, in his twisted, distorted mind, killing his family was a solution. If they were gone, he wouldn't have to face their disappointment. If they were gone, the lie wouldn't be exposed. If they were gone, he could start over, be free, escape the prison he had built. It's insane logic. It's horrifying logic. But to a mind that had been marinating in fear and shame for years, it made a kind of terrible sense. He chose a hammer as his weapon. Why a hammer? I think about that sometimes. A hammer is a tool for building, for construction, for creation. But in Jeffrey's hands, it would become an instrument of annihilation, There's something deeply disturbing about using something so mundane, so common, for something so evil. Hammers hang in garages across America. They're used every day to hang pictures, to fix fences, to build dreams. This one would be used to end them. The night was approaching. The family was unsuspecting. And in his room, Jeffrey Hahn was finalizing his plans, telling himself whatever he needed to tell himself to go through with it. Let me ask you a question, and I mean this seriously. I want you to comment below if you're watching. Have you ever known someone who was suffering and didn't recognize it? Have you ever looked back at a tragedy and realized the signs were there all along, but no one was paying attention? We all have blind spots when it comes to the people we love. We see what we want to see. We believe what we need to believe. What blind spots exist in your own family? Think about it. I'll wait. January 23rd, 2016. A date that would be etched into the memory of everyone who heard about what happened on that quiet California street. A date that 4 people woke up not knowing would be their last. The day passed normally, unbearably normally. Guo Junhan went about his business. Ming Quan prepared meals and tended to the house. The uncle, Meng, enjoyed his visit. Jeffrey's younger brother did whatever 17-year-olds do on a Saturday. They ate dinner together, and they talked. They existed in the orbit of each other's lives without any awareness that the stars were about to fall. Jeffrey was there too, of course, sitting at that table, eating that food, looking into the faces of the people he was about to destroy. What was he thinking? What does a person think in those hours? Does the mind rebel? Does it scream? Or does it grow cold and quiet, shutting down the parts that would prevent what's coming? Night fell. The family retired to their rooms. The house settled into the rhythms of sleep. Breathing slowed. Dreams began. The normal, beautiful, mundane sounds of a family at rest filled the hallways. Jeffrey did not sleep. He waited. In the darkness of his room, he waited. Every minute stretched into an eternity. Every sound from the house was a calculation. Was everyone asleep? Was it time? How do you measure the moment when you're about to end everything? The hammer was already in his hands. What I'm about to describe is difficult. It should be difficult. If it were easy to tell, easy to hear, then something would be wrong with both of us. These are the final moments of innocent lives. They deserve to be told with the weight they carry. Jeffrey's first victim was his mother. Ming Quan Han died in her sleep. She never saw her son coming, never knew that the child she had raised, the son she had sacrificed everything for, was standing over her with a hammer raised above his head. One moment, she was dreaming whatever dreams mothers dream. The next moment, she was gone. The violence was extreme. Blunt force trauma doesn't kill cleanly. It's not like in the movies where one swing does the job. It's brutal, it's visceral. It's the kind of violence that reveals something fundamental about the darkest capabilities of human beings. Guo Junhan was next. The father who had worked so hard. The man who had believed so completely in his son's future. He was killed before he could wake, before he could understand, before he could ask the question that would have had no answer. Why? The uncle, Meng Han, died in the guest room. He had done nothing wrong. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. His only crime was being related to a family that had been targeted from within. His death was collateral damage in a massacre that had no logic. 3 people dead. 3 members of Jeffrey's family bludgeoned beyond recognition. The house that had been so quiet, so peaceful, was now a crime scene. blood soaked into carpets. Walls were spattered. The evidence of what had happened was everywhere, unavoidable, undeniable. But Jeffrey wasn't done. There was still his younger brother. The teenager was in his room, sleeping, trusting, vulnerable. He had no idea what had happened to the rest of his family, no idea that footsteps were approaching his door, no idea that he was next on a list written by madness. Jeffrey entered his brother's room, and then something happened. Something that doesn't fit neatly into the narrative. Something that introduces a crack in the picture of Jeffrey Hahn as a cold, calculated killer. Something that would later become central to understanding what happened that night. Jeffrey hesitated. Looking at his younger brother, perhaps something in him rebelled. Perhaps some fragment of humanity, some echo of brotherly love stayed his hand. Or perhaps it was pragmatic. A witness who wasn't dead could serve a purpose. We may never know exactly what Jeffrey was thinking in that moment. What we know is this: he did not kill his brother. Instead, he woke him up. "We have to go," Jeffrey said. "Someone broke in, someone attacked the family. We have to go now." Imagine being that younger brother. Imagine being shaken awake in the middle of the night and told that your family has been attacked. The fear, the confusion, the complete inability to process what you're being told. You would trust your older brother. Of course you would. He's your brother. Jeffrey hustled his sibling out of the house, away from the bodies, away from the blood. He was creating an alibi. In his plan, the two of them would escape, and Jeffrey would claim they were both victims, survivors of a random home invasion. They got in a car. They drove. Jeffrey's younger brother was in shock, barely able to comprehend what was happening. And Jeffrey was right there beside him, playing the role of fellow victim, of protective older brother, of someone equally traumatized by the events of the night. The Oscar-worthy performance had begun. They eventually ended up at a police station. Jeffrey walked in looking shaken, traumatized. He reported that his family had been attacked, that he and his brother had barely escaped, that there was an intruder. Someone had broken in and killed everyone. The police responded immediately. Units were dispatched to the Hahn residence. Officers entered the house and found what Jeffrey had left behind: the bodies, the blood, the horror. For a brief moment, Jeffrey's story held. Police treated him and his brother as victims, consoled them, offered them support. The investigation began with the assumption that a stranger had committed this atrocity. But investigations have a way of finding the truth. Lies, no matter how elaborate, leave traces. And Jeffrey Hahn's web of deception was about to unravel in ways he never anticipated. The first cracks appeared almost immediately. The crime scene didn't match the home invasion narrative. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. The violence was concentrated entirely on family members, leaving Jeffrey and his brother mysteriously unharmed. Detectives began asking harder questions. Where exactly were you when this happened? Why did the intruder kill everyone else but spare you two? How did you escape without any confrontation? Jeffrey had answers for everything, but his answers were too smooth, too rehearsed. And there was something off about his effect, the way he told his story. Trauma victims display their distress in predictable patterns. Jeffrey's emotional presentation didn't quite fit. And then there was the physical evidence. In his rush to create an alibi, Jeffrey had made mistakes. The kind of mistakes that forensic science exists to find. Traces of blood that shouldn't have been where they were. Inconsistencies in the timeline. Details that didn't add up. The detectives began to circle. They didn't accuse, not yet. But they watched. They listened. They compared notes. And slowly, inexorably, the arrow of suspicion began to point in a direction no one wanted it to go. Toward Jeffrey Han. The surviving younger brother began to have doubts too. As the shock wore off, as his mind began to process the night's events, things started to not make sense. Jeffrey's behavior, Jeffrey's timing, the way they had escaped so easily. Seeds of terrible suspicion began to sprout. And Jeffrey, for all his planning, began to feel the walls closing in again. The days following the murders were a strange limbo. Jeffrey Han walked among the living as a grieving survivor while the bodies of his family awaited autopsy. He accepted condolences. He cried at appropriate moments. He said all the right things about his parents, his uncle, his devastation. But the mask was slipping. Detectives had separated Jeffrey and his brother for questioning. Standard procedure in any investigation, you interview witnesses separately to check for consistency. What they found was troubling. Jeffrey's story was remarkably detailed. Too detailed. He could describe the intruder, the sequence of events, the sounds he heard. But when pressed on specifics, inconsistencies emerged. Times that didn't align. Details that shifted slightly with each telling. The kind of drift that occurs when someone is trying to remember a fabrication rather than a genuine memory. His younger brother's account was different. Traumatized and confused, yes, but genuine in its confusion. He couldn't remember details because he hadn't been awake for most of it. His story had the ragged edges of truth. And there was something else. Something in the way Jeffrey spoke about his family. A distance. A coldness. When genuinely grieving people talk about their loved ones, there's a quality to their words. A warmth, a presence, even through tears. Jeffrey's words were correct, but they were hollow. He was performing grief rather than experiencing it. The forensic evidence was building too. The hammer, the murder weapon. Jeffrey had disposed of it, but not well enough. It was recovered within days, and the evidence it carried was damning. Blood matching all 4 victims. No foreign DNA. No fingerprints except those belonging to someone who would have had every reason to handle a hammer in the family home. Then there was the trajectory analysis. Blood spatter tells a story. The patterns on the walls, the floor, the bedding, they paint a picture of how the violence occurred. That picture showed an attacker who moved through the house with purpose, who knew the layout, who didn't need to search rooms or hesitate in hallways. The attacks were efficient in a way that spoke to familiarity. No stranger did this. The evidence was screaming it. Meanwhile, Jeffrey was beginning to crack under the pressure. The same pressure that had led him to construct lies about UCLA that had driven him to kill rather than face disappointment. That pressure hadn't gone anywhere. It had just found a new focus. He couldn't sleep. Every interaction with police felt like an interrogation. Every sympathetic glance from neighbors felt like accusation. He was living inside another lie now, a bigger lie, and this time, people were actually looking for the truth. His younger brother was becoming a problem too. The teenager was recovering from shock, and as clarity returned, doubt was taking hold. Things didn't add up. Jeffrey's story had holes. And there was something, an instinct, a whisper, a terrible intuition, telling him that his brother was not what he seemed. The brothers were staying with relatives during the investigation. Imagine that household, the tension, the silences. Jeffrey watching his brother for signs of suspicion. The brother watching Jeffrey for signs of guilt. Each of them trapped in a hell of uncertainty and fear. It was during this time that Jeffrey made a critical error. In an attempt to solidify his innocence, he tried to create additional evidence supporting the home invasion theory. He fabricated a story about seeing the intruder more clearly. He offered to help police with a composite sketch. He was inserting himself into the investigation in a way that felt helpful but was actually desperate. Detectives recognized the behavior. They'd seen it before. Perpetrators who involve themselves in investigations, who volunteer information, who seem almost too eager to help solve the crime. It's a type of behavior that raises immediate red flags. They began surveilling Jeffrey, monitoring his movements, recording his conversations, building a case. And Jeffrey, unaware that he was being watched, began to unravel further. His lies about UCLA were discovered. Investigators pulled his actual academic records and found the chasm between reality and the story he'd told his parents. This was significant, not because lying about school is evidence of murder, but because it established a pattern. It showed that Jeffrey Hahn was capable of sustained, elaborate deception. It showed he had motive, the fear of exposure, of disappointment, of shame. The picture was coming together. A young man trapped in a web of lies. Parents who expected perfection. A pressure cooker of expectation and failure. And on one terrible night, an explosion that destroyed everything. It was time for the police to make their move. Jeffrey was brought in for another interview, but this time the tone was different. This time the questions were pointed, accusatory. The detectives laid out the evidence piece by piece, watching his reactions, waiting for the facade to crumble. And crumble it did. Faced with the accumulated weight of forensic evidence, witness inconsistencies, and his own destroyed alibi, Jeffrey Hahn began to confess. Not all at once. It came in pieces like pulling teeth. First, admission of the lies about school. Then acknowledgement that his story about the intruder wasn't entirely accurate. Then, slowly, devastatingly, the truth. He had killed them. His mother, his father, his uncle. All three beaten to death with a hammer while they slept. He had done it because he couldn't face them knowing the truth about him. He had done it because the lie had grown too big to maintain. He had done it because, in his broken mind, it was the only way out. The confession was recorded. Every word, every justification, every hollow explanation for an act that defied explanation. Jeffrey Hahn, the golden son, the UCLA student, the pride of the family, was revealed as a murderer. The younger brother learned the truth. I cannot imagine that moment. Learning that your own brother killed your parents, that the person who saved you that night was the one who created the danger, that you had sat in a car with a murderer, accepted comfort from a killer, believed the lies of someone who had destroyed everything you loved. The betrayal was absolute. Jeffrey Hahn was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. His mugshot showed a young man who looked impossibly ordinary. No horns, no visible evil. Just a face that could have belonged to any college student, any neighbor's kid, anyone. That's the terrifying thing about monsters. They look just like us. When the news broke, the community was shattered. Habra Heights is a small, affluent place where people know each other, where crime is something that happens elsewhere. The idea that such violence could occur in their midst, and that it was perpetrated by a member of the family, not an outside intruder, was almost too much to process. The questions began immediately. How could this happen? Why didn't anyone see the signs? What could have been done differently? And these are the questions that always follow tragedy. We ask them because we're searching for rules, for patterns, for ways to protect ourselves from the randomness of horror. If we can understand why this happened, maybe we can prevent it from happening again. Maybe we can recognize the next Jeffrey Hahn before he reaches for a hammer. But the why of the Hahn family murders doesn't provide easy answers. There's no single cause, no neat explanation. Instead, there's a tangle of factors that, combined in precisely the wrong way, produced a catastrophe. There was the pressure, the relentless, grinding expectation of success that Jeffrey had lived under his entire life. I want to be careful here because I am absolutely not saying that parental expectations cause murder. Millions of children grow up with demanding parents and never harm anyone. But in Jeffrey's case, the pressure interacted with other factors: his personality, his coping mechanisms, his mental state, to create a volatile mixture. There was the lying, the decision made early and reinforced constantly, to deceive rather than disappoint. Each lie dug the hole deeper. Each fabrication built the walls higher. By the time Jeffrey realized how trapped he was, the walls seemed insurmountable. There was the isolation. Jeffrey had no one to confide in. His family couldn't be trusted with the truth. His friends were kept at arm's length because intimacy threatened exposure. He was alone with his fear and his shame. And in that solitude, dark thoughts could grow unchecked. There was the absence of intervention. No teacher noticed. No counselor reached out. No family member broke through the facade to ask if he was okay. The system that might have caught him falling had no idea he was in trouble. And there was something else, something harder to name. A coldness at Jeffrey's core that allowed him to contemplate and then execute the murder of people who loved him. Not everyone who lies about school becomes a murderer. Something specific to Jeffrey Hahn allowed him to cross that unthinkable line. Psychiatric evaluations would later reveal a young man with significant psychological dysfunction. Not insanity, not in the legal sense. Jeffrey knew what he was doing was wrong. He was capable of forming intent and understanding consequences. But his emotional development was stunted. His ability to empathize, to truly feel the reality of other people's pain, was compromised. He could plan a murder because, in some fundamental way, his victims weren't fully real to him. They were obstacles, threats, problems to be solved. The fact that they were also his mother, his father, his uncle, that fact was overshadowed by his desperate need to escape exposure. This doesn't excuse him. Nothing excuses him. But it helps explain how a person gets to the point where they can do something so monstrous. In the aftermath of the arrest, people wanted to assign blame. The parents were blamed for being too demanding. Jeffrey was blamed for being too weak to handle pressure. The education system was blamed for not catching his academic struggles. Asian culture was blamed for valuing achievement over emotional health. All of these critiques contain kernels of truth, but none of them capture the whole picture. The Hahn family tragedy was the result of multiple failures combining in a way that no single intervention might have prevented. It was systemic, personal, cultural, and psychological all at once. For the surviving brother, there was no comfort in understanding why. Understanding didn't bring his parents back. Understanding didn't erase the horror of that night or the betrayal of learning who was responsible. He had lost his entire immediate family, 3 to death and 1 to monstrosity. The survivor's journey was just beginning. He would have to testify. He would have to relive the worst night of his life in a courtroom, facing his brother, speaking the truth that would help convict him. He would have to find a way to live with the knowledge that he had slept under the same roof as a killer, that he had been spared through some unfathomable choice his brother made. Why did Jeffrey spare his brother? That question haunted everyone. Was it love? Some vestige of fraternal affection that Jeffrey couldn't overcome? Or was it calculation? Needing a witness to corroborate the fake home invasion story, or something else entirely? Some impulse that Jeffrey himself might not fully understand. When asked in interrogation, Jeffrey's answer was unsatisfying. He didn't want to kill his brother. That's what he said. As if want was a sufficient explanation, as if the murders of his parents and uncle were things he wanted to do. The answer revealed nothing except the depth of Jeffrey's disconnection from normal human emotion. The younger brother would carry that ambiguity forever, spared by the same hand that killed everyone else he loved, living because his murderer brother chose to let him live. It's a burden that defies imagination. As the case moved toward trial, the community tried to heal. Neighbors organized. Support networks formed. The Hahn family home, that silent house of horrors, stood empty, a reminder that no one wanted but couldn't ignore. And in a jail cell, Jeffrey Hahn awaited his fate. The trial of Jeffrey Hahn began with the weight of 3 lives hanging over every moment. The courtroom was packed. Media filled the gallery. The public, fascinated and horrified in equal measure, followed every development. Jeffrey entered looking diminished. Gone was the young man who had confidently spun lies about UCLA. In his place was someone hollowed out, reduced. He moved slowly, spoke quietly, met no one's eyes. His defense team faced an impossible task, and the evidence was overwhelming. The confession was on record. The only real question was not whether Jeffrey was guilty, but what that guilt would mean. First-degree murder with special circumstances, or something lesser. Life in prison or the possibility of eventual freedom. The defense's strategy was to paint a picture of a young man broken by pressure. They called experts to testify about the psychological toll of academic expectations in high-achievement households. They presented evidence of Jeffrey's deteriorating mental state in the months before the murders. They tried to humanize him, to make the jury see not a monster, but a tragically damaged person who had snapped under unbearable weight. The prosecution had no patience for such narratives. These were planned murders, they argued. Jeffrey had thought about this, prepared for it, executed it with precision. He had covered his tracks and created alibis. This was not a moment of madness, but a deliberate, calculated elimination of obstacles. The surviving brother took the stand. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The only other person present that night, the one Jeffrey had spared, the living reminder of what had been lost. He sat in the witness chair and faced his brother across the courtroom. What passed between them in that look? What can two brothers communicate in a glance when one has destroyed everything and the other has been left to pick up the pieces? The younger brother's testimony was devastating. He described the night in detail, being woken up, being told there was an intruder fleeing the house. He described his brother's demeanor, calm and controlled when terror would have been appropriate. He described the growing suspicion, the realization, the shattering of every belief he'd held about his family. When the defense cross-examined, they tried to suggest that the younger brother might be mistaken, might be projecting, might be influenced by police suggestion. But his testimony held. He wasn't accusing Jeffrey of anything. He was simply describing what he observed. And what he observed painted a picture of a calculated killer. The evidence phase was extensive. Forensic experts testified about blood patterns, about the hammer, about the impossibility of the crime matching Jeffrey's initial story. Investigators walked through the timeline, showing how every piece of Jeffrey's fiction crumbled under examination. The lies about UCLA were presented not as direct evidence of murder, but as proof of Jeffrey's capacity for deception. Jeffrey did not testify in his own defense. His lawyers knew better than to put him on the stand. Under cross-examination, his cold effect, his tendency towards self-serving explanations, would have damaged any sympathy the defense had managed to build. Better to let the experts speak for him, to let the narrative of pressure and mental health stand without Jeffrey personally undermining it. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. The prosecution spoke for the dead, for Guo Junhan, who had worked so hard and trusted so completely, for Ming Huanhan, who had given everything to her children and received death in return, for Meng Han, whose only crime was visiting family. They spoke about premeditation, about calculation, about a killer who had looked into his mother's sleeping face and raised a hammer anyway. The defense spoke about tragedy, about a system that failed a struggling young man, about pressure that broke a psyche, about mental illness that, while not excusing the crimes, should mitigate the punishment. They asked for a sentence that acknowledged Jeffrey's youth, his remorse, his potential for eventual rehabilitation. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty. First-degree murder, all 3 counts. Special circumstances attached due to the multiple victims. Jeffrey Han sat motionless as the verdict was read. Whatever he felt, relief, despair, emptiness, he kept it hidden. He'd worn a mask his entire adult life, and even now, at the moment of his greatest exposure, the mask remained partially in place. Sentencing would come later. But the verdict was clear. Jeffrey Han would never walk free again. In the gallery, the younger brother wept. Not from satisfaction, how could there be satisfaction in any of this? But from something more complex. Release, perhaps, an ending. The ability to finally close one chapter of this nightmare, even knowing that new chapters of grief awaited. The trial was over. But for everyone touched by this tragedy, the real work of living with its aftermath was just beginning. Jeffrey Han was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars. The golden son, the fake UCLA student, the family killer. He would spend the rest of his existence in a cell. His name, synonymous with betrayal and horror. But this story isn't really about Jeffrey. Not ultimately. This story is about survival, about what happens after the unthinkable, about the human capacity to continue existing when everything that made life meaningful has been destroyed. The younger brother, let's call him David, though I'm protecting his identity because he deserves whatever privacy remains possible, faced an impossible task. At 17, he had lost his parents, his uncle, and his brother. Everything he thought he knew about his family was revealed to be built on lies. The home he grew up in was a crime scene. The brother he had trusted had murdered everyone while he slept. How does a person recover from that? The immediate aftermath was mechanical. Logistics, funeral arrangements for 3 people, estate matters, living arrangements. A 17-year-old suddenly having to navigate adult responsibilities while processing trauma that would break most adults. Extended family rallied. Aunts, uncles, cousins from both sides emerged to provide support. David moved in with relatives who did their best to create stability amid chaos. But stability was relative. Every night brought dreams. Every day brought reminders. Every quiet moment allowed the memories to surface. He finished high school. That alone was an achievement. Showing up, completing assignments, graduating, all while carrying weight that would have crushed most people. His teachers knew his story, his classmates knew. He walked through hallways marked by whispers and stares, by curiosity and pity. College came next. David chose to leave California. The distance wasn't just geographical, it was psychological. He needed to be somewhere that didn't know him as the brother, somewhere he could be David first, defined by who he was becoming rather than what had happened to him. But you can't outrun trauma. It travels with you, packed in your bags, whether you want it or not. David struggled. Depression, anxiety, the specific kind of survivor's guilt that comes from being spared when others weren't. Why him? Why did Jeffrey let him live? The question tormented him. Therapy helped. Slowly, painfully, he began to process what had happened. Not to get over it. You don't get over something like this, but to integrate it. To find a way to carry it that didn't crush him. He learned that he was not responsible for his brother's choices. He learned that his survival wasn't a burden he needed to justify. He learned that honoring his parents' memory meant living well, not living in perpetual grief. These lessons didn't come easy. They came through years of work, through countless sessions with counselors and support groups, through setbacks and breakthroughs, through the slow, grinding process of rebuilding a self from the wreckage of a shattered family. Meanwhile, the story of the Hahn family murders echoed through culture. It became a case study in psychology courses. It was featured in true crime documentaries. The name Hahn became synonymous with parental pressure and deadly secrets. This bothered David. His parents, his loving, flawed human parents, were being reduced to cautionary tales. The pressure they'd applied to their sons was being portrayed as the cause of the murders, as if they had brought this on themselves. It wasn't fair, it wasn't true. Yes, his parents had been demanding. Yes, they had placed enormous value on academic success. But millions of parents did the same without producing murderers. Jeffrey's crimes were Jeffrey's. The responsibility was his alone. David began to speak out, slowly at first, in small forums, then more publicly. He wanted to reclaim his parents' memory, to remind people that Guo and Ming Huan Han were victims, not villains. that they were complex, loving people who deserved to be remembered for more than their deaths. He also spoke about sibling betrayal, about what it means to discover that someone you trusted completely was capable of absolute evil. His words resonated with others who had experienced betrayal, not at the extreme level David had, but betrayal nonetheless. Years passed. David graduated from college. He built a career, he formed relationships, he did all the things that had seemed impossible in those dark days after the murders. He proved that survival was possible, that trauma didn't have to be a life sentence. But he never forgot. Every anniversary of the murders, he honored his parents and uncle. He kept their photographs. He told their stories to people who would listen. He made sure that they were remembered as people, not just victims. And he never visited Jeffrey in prison, not once. His brother had reached out, tried to initiate contact. David refused. There was nothing Jeffrey could say that David needed to hear. No explanation that would suffice. No apology that could bridge the chasm between them. Some relationships cannot be repaired. Some betrayals are final. David understood this, and he was at peace with it. 10 years after the murders, David sat in a cafe in a city far from California. He was 30 years old now. The teenager who had been shaken awake on that terrible night had become a man, a successful man, a man who had built something meaningful from the ashes of his family. He thought about his parents often, wondered what they would think of who he'd become. He hadn't followed the path they'd imagined for him. He'd chosen his own way, a career they might not have understood but would have supported, because that's what parents do. They adapt, they accept, they love. At least most parents do. David had come to terms with the fact that his parents, like all parents, were imperfect. The pressure they'd placed on their sons had been misguided, even damaging. But it came from love, from a sincere desire to see their children succeed. They hadn't known any other way. He no longer blamed them for Jeffrey's actions. That blame had evaporated somewhere in his mid-20s, worked through in therapy, released through grief. Jeffrey chose murder, Jeffrey alone. The surviving brother had also made peace with his own survival. For years, he'd carried guilt about being spared. The question, why me, had tormented him endlessly. But eventually, he'd arrived at an answer that satisfied him. There was no why. Jeffrey's decision was irrational, inexplicable, based on the twisted logic of a broken mind. Looking for reason in it was like looking for meaning in a random number. David chose to survive. That was the answer. He chose to keep living, to keep moving forward, to not let his brother's violence define the rest of his existence. And in that choosing, he found purpose. He had started speaking at events, conferences on trauma recovery, support groups for survivors of family violence. His story resonated, not because it was sensational, but because it was real. Here was someone who had experienced the worst and come through. His presence gave others hope. He spoke about the importance of communication, about breaking the cycle of pressure and lies, about seeking help when you're struggling instead of hiding behind facades. Every time he spoke, he felt like he was honoring his parents' memory. They had wanted their children to make a difference in the world. This wasn't the difference they'd imagined, but it was difference nonetheless. He also spoke about justice, about the importance of holding people accountable for their choices. Jeffrey's sentence hadn't brought his parents back, but it had mattered. It had said clearly and definitively that what happened was wrong, that 3 lives had value, that their deaths would not go unpunished. The true crime attention had faded over the years. New cases captured public fascination. The Hahn family murders became one tragedy among many, filed away in the archives of American crime. But for David, it was never just a story, it was his life. He had built a family of his own now, a partner who understood, friends who knew his history and loved him anyway. He had created what his brother had destroyed, a home filled with trust and honesty. Sometimes late at night, the memories would surface. The house, the blood, the moment he learned the truth. These moments never disappeared entirely. They just became less frequent, less overwhelming, more integrated into the fabric of who he was. He was the brother who survived, but he was also so much more. In his prison cell, Jeffrey Hahn grew old. The young man who had been booked at 23 was now past 40. His hair had grayed, his face had lined. The years in prison had aged him in ways that freedom might not have. He had time in prison, endless time. Time to think about what he had done. Time to confront the reality of 3 lives ended by his hands. Time to live with memories that offered no escape. Jeffrey had tried to reach his brother many times over the years. Letters that went unanswered. Requests for visits that were denied. He had things he wanted to say, explanations, apologies, pleas for some kind of connection. But David's silence was absolute, and so Jeffrey wrote letters that he knew would never be sent. In these letters, he tried to explain himself, not to justify, even he knew there was no justification, but to articulate the twisted logic that had led him to that night. The pressure, the lies, the feeling of walls closing in, the terrible, irrational conviction that murder was the only escape. Reading those letters, if anyone ever did, they would find a man struggling to understand his own actions. A man who had committed an atrocity and couldn't quite believe he was capable of it. A man who, in the quiet of his cell, was haunted by the faces of the people he had killed. Was he remorseful? That question depends on what we mean by remorse. Jeffrey expressed regret. He said he wished things had been different. He acknowledged that what he did was wrong. But true remorse requires empathy, the ability to feel genuinely and deeply the pain you have caused. And empathy had always been Jeffrey's blind spot. He could understand intellectually that he had destroyed lives. He could say the words of apology. But whether he felt them in the way that normal people feel them remained uncertain. The same emotional stunting that had allowed him to commit the murders also limited his capacity for genuine remorse afterward. Prison had changed him in some ways. He had gotten his education, really gotten it this time, completing degrees through prison programs. He had found religion, like so many prisoners do. He had participated in therapy and counseling. He had become a model inmate, if such a thing exists. But none of it mattered. He would die in prison. The lives he had taken would never be returned. The damage he had done would never be undone. On the anniversary of the murders each year, Jeffrey sat in his cell and remembered. He remembered his mother's face, his father's voice, his uncle's laugh. He remembered them alive the way they had been before he reduced them to victims. And he remembered his brother, the brother he had spared, the brother who had grown up and moved on and built a life. the brother who wanted nothing to do with him. In his unsent letters, Jeffrey sometimes asked for forgiveness, but he knew better than to expect it. Some acts are beyond forgiveness. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. He would die alone. That was his punishment. Not just the walls and the bars and the sentence, but the absolute isolation. The knowledge, that he had severed himself from humanity through his own choices. The understanding that he would face his end without anyone who loved him by his side. This was justice. Cold, complete, and final. This story began with a monster at the dinner table. It began with the terrible truth that the people most dangerous to us are sometimes the ones we trust the most. It began with a house on a hillside and the silence that followed violence. But this story doesn't end with the monster. David, the surviving brother, the one who rebuilt his life from rubble, stood in front of a gathering of survivors. It was a support group meeting held in a community center far from California, filled with people who had experienced their own versions of the unthinkable. He told his story. He told it simply, without sensationalism, without drama. He told it because every time he told it, someone in the audience found hope, found the knowledge that survival was possible, found the courage to take one more step on their own journey. I used to think I would never be okay, he said. I used to think that what happened defined me completely, that I would always be the brother who survived and nothing else. But I was wrong. The audience listened. Some wept. Some nodded in recognition. We don't get to choose what happens to us. We don't get to choose the families we're born into or the secrets those families keep. We don't get to choose whether the people we love betray us in the worst possible ways. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. But we get to choose what happens next. We get to choose whether the tragedy becomes our whole story or just one chapter in a longer book. We get to choose whether we let destruction have the final word. After the meeting, people approached him. They thanked him. They shared fragments of their own stories. They connected with him in the way that survivors connect with each other, through understanding that words can never fully capture. Walking to his car afterward, David thought about his parents, about the dreams they'd had for him, about the pressure they'd applied, and the love that motivated it. They had wanted him to be successful. They had wanted him to matter. He mattered. Not in the way they had imagined, but he mattered. Every person he helped, every story he told, every moment of hope he provided to someone drowning in their own tragedy. That was his success. That was his legacy. And in that legacy, his parents lived on. Not as cautionary tales, not as victims, but as the people who raised a son strong enough to survive the unsurvivable. A son who turned the worst night of his life into a mission to help others through theirs. The Hahn family tragedy would always be tragic. 3 innocent people were dead. That would never change. The loss would never heal completely, and the scars would never fully fade. But from that tragedy came something unexpected, something that felt, in its own strange way, like victory. David got in his car and drove home, to his partner, to his life, to the future he had built with his own hands. Behind him, the sun was setting. Another day ending. Another step forward on a journey that had no destination, but was valuable for the traveling. The monster had tried to destroy everything, but the monster had failed, because here was David, alive, thriving, refusing to let his brother's violence be the end of the story, The Hahn family tragedy ended with 3 deaths and 1 imprisonment. But this story, the real story, ends with something else. It ends with survival. It ends with hope. It ends with the unshakable truth that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can find a way forward. And if you're watching this, if you're carrying your own burden, if you're trapped in your own web of secrets or pressure or pain, know that there is a way out. A way that doesn't involve destruction, a way that leads to something better. Don't let your story end in tragedy. Let it end in triumph, like David's did. Subscribe if this story moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the most important chapter of your life is always the next one.